The Pharaoh's last stand, the Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BC. It was supposed to be a march to glory. Instead, it became the most chaotic clash of the ancient world, beneath the blazing Syrian sun. 20,000 Egyptian soldiers followed Pharaoh Ramesses II, the so-called living god, into a valley that would soon swallow their hopes whole. They believed the Hittite Empire was retreating. They were wrong. Hiding behind the ridges, 3,500 Hittite chariots waited, the largest chariot ambush in recorded history. When the dust rose, the sky vanished. Bronze wheels thundered like drums of doom. In that moment, Ramses realized he had been tricked, but here's the part most people never hear. Ramses didn't run against impossible odds. He turned the chaos into legend. This is the untold story of betrayal, courage, and survival. The battle that defined empires and rewrote the laws of ancient warfare. Before we uncover the Pharaoh's last stand, make sure you subscribe, like, and comment your favorite ancient battle below, because you're about to witness history the way it was never told. The deception of kings. The sands of Syria shimmered like gold that morning. To the Egyptians, it was a sacred omen, the sun god Ra blessing Pharaoh Ramses' march to glory. But omens have a cruel way of changing shape when pride blinds the eyes that see them. It was the 5th year of Ramses' reign. Egypt had risen again, a colossus stretching from the Nile Delta to the gates of Canaan. The young pharaoh, barely in his 20s, hungered not just for conquest but for immortality. And to claim it, he would have to crush Egypt's oldest rival, the Hittite Empire. Masters of iron and deception, their king, Muwatalli II, ruled from the north, cunning, patient, and ruthless. He had lost ground to Egypt before. But this time, he would not meet Ramses in the open. He would wait, and strike like a serpent from the shadows. Ramses, in his splendor, rode at the head of 4 divisions, Amen, Ra, Ptah, and Set, over 20,000 soldiers, archers, spearmen. Charioteers moved through the rugged passes toward the city of Kadesh, where the Orontes River coiled like a silver snake beneath the walls. And here's the shocking truth most never learn. Ramses believed Kadesh was undefended. He believed victory was only days away, but Muwatalli had already filled the city with his army. He had hidden thousands of men behind the hills north of the plain, chariots armed with spears and iron blades that could shred through Egyptian ranks like reeds. Yet the trap would never have worked without one act of brilliant deceit. 2 men stumbled into Ramses' camp, dusty, trembling, claiming to be Hittite deserters. They swore that Muwatalli and his army had fled north, terrified by the pharaoh's advance. Ramses, eager to claim the glory, believed them. He didn't know they were spies. What happened next? The narrator's voice drops. No historian expected. That night, the pharaoh ordered his Amen division to make camp outside Kadesh. The other divisions trailed far behind, days of marching apart. His army was stretched thin, blind in foreign land. Still, Ramses slept beneath the stars, confident that Ra himself watched over him. The air was calm, the torches burned steady. But beyond the flicker of light, the hills were alive, filled with whispering soldiers and the faint creak of chariot axles. At dawn, the first omen came. A captured Hittite scout, trembling, bleeding, confessed the truth. The Hittite army was not gone. It was right there. Behind the hills, Ramses' eyes widened. The blood drained from his face. For the first time, the living god felt fear. He turned to his commanders. Summon the Ra division. Bring them here at once. But it was too late. The message would take hours to reach them. From the ridges to the north, dust began to rise, thick, golden, unnatural. It grew larger, louder, heavier, until it sounded like the roar of thunder. Then came the chariots. 3,500 bronze machines of war tore through the horizon, wheels screaming, blades glinting in the sun. Horses pounded the earth. The Hittites were not running. They were charging. And in that instant everything changed. The Egyptian camp erupted into chaos. Horses bolted. Soldiers shouted, scattered, grabbed whatever they could. The chariots smashed into tents and men alike, crushing, slicing, Overturning everything in their path, Ramses' guards tried to form a line, but the dust blinded them. The smell of iron and blood filled the air. Arrows whistled through the haze. The once glorious army of Amun was collapsing. But here's the part most people never knew. The narrator's tone lowers as if sharing a secret. The pharaoh didn't flee. He leapt onto his golden chariot, his bodyguard beside him. The banner of Ra fluttered above, red and gold against the storm. Ramses gripped the reins, his jaw set. The air trembled with the scream of horses. He charged straight into the oncoming Hittite wave. The two forces collided in a chaos so thick it swallowed the sun. The pharaoh's arrows tore through the first line. His horses veered, slashing between chariots, his blade carving arcs of sunlight through the dust. But it wasn't enough. The numbers were too many. For every chariot Ramses struck down, 3 more appeared. He was surrounded. And then silence. The world slowed. In that suspended heartbeat, Ramses saw them, hundreds of Hittite warriors closing in. Their faces hidden behind leather and iron. Their eyes cold as stone. He whispered a prayer to Amun, "Grant me strength, for Egypt's heart beats through me." And something inside him snapped or awakened. He rode harder, faster, his chariot spinning in tight circles, cutting through the enemy like a storm through grain. His personal guard followed, a handful of men against thousands. What happened next? Historians still argue about. Some say divine intervention saved him. Others believe it was sheer will. But suddenly, from the southern trail, the Ra division appeared, the very men Ramses had summoned hours before. Exhausted, dusty, but alive, they charged into the fray, spears leveled, shouting the pharaoh's name. The balance shifted. The Hittites, once confident, faltered. Ramses, seizing the moment, roared above the din, "Forward! For Egypt!" The desert itself seemed to shake. But fate had something else planned. As the Egyptians pushed forward. Muwatalli's second wave, hidden even deeper behind the hills, began to move. Thousands more chariots, fresh and ready, began circling toward the battlefield. Ramses didn't know it yet, but his brief resurgence was about to meet another storm. Still, for now, the pharaoh stood, battered, bloodied, but unbroken, a living symbol of defiance. His men rallied to him, their courage rekindled by the sight of their king fighting beside them. The sun dipped low. Shadows stretched long across the blood-soaked sand. The cries of dying men mingled with the hiss of arrows, and as night fell over Kadesh, one question burned in every soldier's heart. Would the pharaoh survive another dawn? Or would the sands of Syria become his tomb? The answer would come with the next sunrise. The ambush in the dust the night at Kadesh was a breathing thing, restless, heavy, alive with whispers of pain. Torches flickered over the wounded. The desert wind carried the scent of sweat, blood, and broken bronze. In the distance, wolves howled. Or maybe they were men, lost and dying in the dark. Ramses stood alone beside his chariot, his armor dented, streaked with red dust and dried blood. The once gleaming gold reflected the campfires like a dying sun. Around him, soldiers tended the injured, muttering prayers to Amun, begging the gods not to abandon them. The living god of Egypt, the pharaoh himself, had seen fear that day. And yet, he still breathed, but survival was not victory. And deep inside, Ramses knew the Hittites were not finished. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the Syrian plain, the sound began again, faint at first, like distant thunder. Then louder. Chariots, thousands of them, from the hills north of Kadesh. Muwatalli too unleashed his second assault, the full force of the Hittite Empire this time. The desert itself seemed to rise against Egypt. The ground shook. Dust rose in colossal clouds, blotting out the sun. Horses screamed, their hooves pounding like the drums of an army of ghosts, and for the first time in recorded history, 2 entire civilizations collided not with swords, but with wheels. The Hittite chariots were massive, heavier than Egypt's, built for shock and crush. 3 men rode each, a driver, a lancer, and a shield-bearer. The Egyptian chariots, smaller and faster, were designed for agility, for archers to strike while in motion. What began as a battle soon became a storm of bronze and bone. Ramses mounted his chariot once more. He had slept no more than an hour. The heat shimmered across the sand, making the world seem unreal, like the gods were watching from behind a veil. "Form ranks," he shouted. His voice cut through the roar like a blade. "Hold the line!" But there was no line, only chaos. The Hittites slammed into the Egyptian camps from three sides, scattering the Ra and Amen divisions once more. It was at that moment Ramses saw something that made his heart freeze: Hittite chariots storming through his own royal camp, seizing the golden throne he had left behind, his own symbol of power, trampled into the dirt. And this was the humiliation he could not allow. With a shout, he drove his horses forward, straight into the heart of the Hittite wave. His chariot cut through the sand like lightning through clouds. His bell sang, arrows piercing men and horses alike. His royal guards followed, a dozen chariots slashing through the tide, but for every enemy they struck down, 10 more rose. The narrator's voice drops. And this is where everything changed. A cry went up from the west, the sound of trumpets. Through the haze of war, banners appeared, blue and gold. It was the Pata division, finally arriving after days of forced march. Exhausted but alive, they charged into the fray, their chariots slamming into the Hittite flank. The battlefield turned into a maelstrom, arrows, dust, screams. No one could tell friend from foe. The sand turned red beneath their feet, but Ramses kept moving, weaving through the storm, rallying his men by sheer presence. His voice carried over the chaos. "Stand with me, for Egypt, for the gods who watch us now." And in that instant something shifted. The Egyptian lines began to reform. Soldiers who moments ago had cowered behind broken wagons now raised their shields and advanced. The Hittites, overconfident from their ambush, were suddenly pressed back. Still, the pharaoh's life hung by a thread. A Hittite spear struck his chariot's side, splintering the wood. His driver cried out, struck in the shoulder. The horses reared, screaming. Ramses barely held control. The dust was so thick he could see only flashes of bronze and flame, and then, through the haze, a Hittite chariot bore down on him, its driver grinning, spear poised to strike. Ramses drew his bow. One breath. One heartbeat. He loosed. The arrow struck true. The Hittite fell, his body rolling beneath the wheels. The chariot toppled, crashing into another. The sand swallowed both in a spray of dust. Still, Ramses didn't smile. He knew this wasn't over. The Hittites were falling back, but not retreating. They were regrouping. From the ridge above Kadesh, Muwatalli watched. His army still outnumbered the Egyptians. And yet, he hesitated. Perhaps he saw something that unsettled him, the sight of a pharaoh standing, covered in dust and blood, refusing to die. The voice lowers, tense. What happened next? No one expected. As the Hittite chariots wheeled for another charge, the ground trembled again, but this time, not from them. From the south, a new formation appeared. It was the Niran, a reserve force. Allies from Amurru, marching to Egypt's aid. Ramses had summoned them days earlier, a desperate gamble. No one knew if they'd arrive in time, but now they had. The arrival of the Niran changed everything. Fresh soldiers surged across the battlefield, catching the Hittites between 3 Egyptian divisions. The desert thundered with renewed fury. Muwatalli's chariots, caught between collapsing fronts, began to falter. Still, Ramses did not relent. His voice roared over the chaos, commanding, divine. "Now, drive them into the river." And the Hittites broke, chariots overturned. Men fell into the Orontes, dragged under by armor and horses. The battlefield that had once promised Egypt's destruction now echoed with Hittite cries of retreat, but Ramses didn't chase them. He stood amidst the wreckage, staring at the smoking horizon. Thousands lay dead, Egyptian and Hittite alike. The air was thick with ash and mourning. Most people never knew this detail. The pharaoh's victory at Kadesh was not a triumph. It was survival. Both sides claimed success. But neither conquered the other. As the sun sank behind the western hills, Ramses walked alone along the riverbank. The water reflected crimson light, as if the gods themselves bled into the earth. Behind him, The wounded called out for water. Priests whispered prayers over the fallen. The wind carried the smell of charred wood and fear. Ramesses knelt by the water's edge, his reflection broken by ripples. For the first time, he looked not like a god, but a man, mortal, scarred, and painfully aware that his legend had come at a terrible cost. Yet in his silence, something unspoken stirred, the understanding that survival itself could be turned into glory. The world would never know the truth. The pharaoh would not let them. He rose, the fire of ambition rekindled in his eyes. "We will return," he murmured. "And Egypt will remember this day not as defeat, but as destiny." Far away, beyond the hills, Muwatalli's scouts watched the Egyptian fires burn through the night. They knew Ramesses would march again, and when he did, the Hittite Empire would be ready, but fate had other plans. Ones that neither king could see. The desert was silent once more, the winds whispering over broken shields and forgotten names. Somewhere in that silence, history was already deciding which of them would be remembered as the victor. And as the night deepened, a final, lingering question hung over the ruins of Kadesh. Was this the birth of Ramesses the Great, or the beginning of his myth? The pharaoh alone, the wind, howled across the ruins of Kadesh as if the gods themselves were mourning. The fires had burned low, leaving only smoke curling from shattered chariots and broken spears. The battlefield, once alive with the clash of nations, was now a graveyard of silence. Ramesses stood at its center, alone beneath the rising sun. His armor hung heavy on his shoulders, streaked with blood, his own and that of others. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for movement, for life, for anything that proved Egypt still stood. He had survived the ambush, defied annihilation, and driven the Hittites back to the river. But at what cost? The ground was littered with Egyptian dead, men who had followed him across deserts, who had believed in his divinity. Their faces were covered now, their names soon to be forgotten. For a moment, the young pharaoh said nothing. He simply listened to the wind brushing the sand, to the moans of the dying, to the sound of distant waters where the Orontes still flowed red. They said the gods favored Ramesses. Yet standing there, surrounded by ruin, he wondered if the gods were watching at all. Then came a voice, hoarse, trembling. "My pharaoh? The Hittites still hold the city." It was his captain, wounded but alive. "They've retreated behind Kadesh's walls." Muwatalli's banners fly still. Ramesses turned toward the city. The walls loomed like a sleeping beast, its gates sealed, its towers black with archers. Inside those walls waited the army that had nearly ended Egypt. And here's the truth few know: Ramesses could not attack. His chariots were broken, his soldiers exhausted. To strike now would mean total destruction. Yet to retreat meant admitting defeat. He clenched his fists. "We will not leave this land without our honor." He ordered his remaining troops to encamp along the river. Fires were lit, banners raised, horns sounded, a show of strength. To the Hittites, it would appear the Egyptians were regrouping for another assault. In reality, Ramesses was buying time. The hours dragged on beneath the searing sun. Messengers came and went. Scouts brought news of the Hittite king. Muwatalli was fortifying Kadesh, expecting another Egyptian attack, but Ramesses had no army left to give. He knew it, his commanders knew it, and so he made a choice that would define his legend. He called his scribes. "Prepare the tablets. We will record this day." The scribes hesitated. "My lord, what shall we write?" Ramesses looked toward the city, his eyes burning with something between defiance and revelation. "Write the truth, that Pharaoh stood alone against thousands and turned the tide by the will of the gods." And there was the seed of immortality. What happened next? No historian expected. As the Egyptians feigned preparation for battle, Muwatalli sent envoys under truce. They carried messages of peace, offers to end the fighting. The Hittite king, too, had suffered. His men were weary, his supply lines stretched thin. He had no appetite for another slaughter, yet neither side could admit weakness. The desert became a stage of deception. Ramesses paraded his surviving chariots each morning, circling the camp, horns blaring, drums echoing across the plain. to make the Hittites believe Egypt still commanded tens of thousands. From the city walls, it looked like an army reborn, but at night, the truth lingered in the silence, tense, half-empty, wounded, whispering prayers. The pharaoh pacing alone beneath the stars, the camera lingers close. Ramses' face, lit by firelight, is young, too young for the burden he carries. Sweat beads on his brow. His hands tremble slightly as he grips his sword. He looks toward the horizon and whispers, "I have faced your storms, Amun, if I fall here. Let Egypt remember my stand." And for the first time, he feels the weight of being mortal, not divine. Not eternal, but a man who bled, who doubted, who feared. Then, a sound in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Hooves. Ramses stiffened. Another attack? The guards rushed to the edge of the camp, bows drawn. But out of the dusk came Egyptian scouts, their torches blazing. They shouted, "Reinforcements!" From the south. Hundreds of chariots, soldiers from the Set division, long delayed by floods along the coast, now arrived. Their arrival was like breath after drowning. Cheers erupted through the camp. Ramses mounted his chariot once more, the banner of Ra fluttering behind him. "By the will of the gods," he shouted, "we rise again." The Egyptians thundered across the plain once more, not to conquer, but to prove they still lived. They struck at the outskirts of Kadesh, forcing the Hittite skirmishers back behind the gates. Dust and sunlight mingled into gold as the pharaoh led his final charge. The clash was brief but ferocious. Spears clashed, arrows rained, and for a moment Ramses and Muwatalli's forces faced each other once more across the river. Neither advanced, neither broke, and then silence. Muwatalli watched from the walls, arms folded. The Egyptian king, covered in blood and glory, stared back across the distance. Both men knew another battle would destroy them both. So, without a word, they ended it. The Hittites withdrew into their city. The Egyptians held the field outside. Neither side claimed victory, yet neither side surrendered. Still, Ramses understood what few ever would. History doesn't remember the truth. It remembers the story and his story. He would write himself that night. The scribes began engraving what would later be known as the Poem of Pentor, an account of the pharaoh's heroism at Kadesh. In it, Ramses stood not as a man nearly crushed, but as a god of war, single-handedly repelling thousands. It would be carved on temple walls, told to generations as proof of divine kingship. Most people never knew this detail. That the victory of Kadesh was not won on the battlefield, but in words etched into stone by command of a king who refused to lose. The voice slows, heavy with reverence. And this is where everything changed. Ramses' name spread like fire through Egypt. Songs praised him as the strong bull, the slayer of Hittites, the son of Ra. His image was carved into temples from Abu Simbel to Thebes. He became not just pharaoh, he became myth, but myths are fragile things. Years later, when Ramses would march again against the Hittites, he'd find the same enemy waiting, unbroken, unbent. And in the end, he would realize that no army could conquer forever. The truth of Kadesh, the fear, the near destruction, the desperate courage would remain buried beneath the sands, hidden by the stone walls that bore his glory. Yet that night, as Ramses looked over the camp, listening to the quiet breathing of his soldiers, he knew the gods had given him something greater than conquest. They had given him survival, and with it, the power to shape how the world would remember. He gazed once more toward the sleeping city of Kadesh. "You may hold your walls, Muwatalli," he murmured, "but I will hold eternity." The wind shifted, carrying the faint echoes of drums across the plain, not from the Egyptians, but from within Kadesh. The Hittites were preparing for something. Ramses turned, his face half in shadow, eyes narrow. "They will not rest," he whispered. "Nor will I." The camera pans upward, to the endless Syrian sky, red and gold with the dying light. In that moment, Pharaoh Ramses II was no longer just a king. He was a man standing between history and legend, between mortality and myth, and he would not step back. The turning of the tide. The years rolled like the desert wind, hot, relentless, and without mercy. The Battle of Kadesh had not broken Egypt, but it had scarred it. Every man who had marched into that valley carried its ghosts for life. Yet the pharaoh who had nearly fallen there, Ramses, son of Seti, born of Ra, refused to let those ghosts define him. He had stared death in the face and survived. That survival had become legend, and that legend had become power. Now, that power needed to be proven again. The opening scene fades in over the Nile. The temples gleam in the sunlight. Priests chant hymns to the pharaoh's glory. And across the walls of Luxor, masons carve the tale of Kadesh, not as defeat but as divine triumph. The inscriptions show Ramses standing alone in his chariot, arrows flying. Enemies crushed beneath his horses. But here's the truth behind the stone as those carvings were made. Egypt was still bleeding from the wounds of that war. For years after Kadesh, border raids continued. The lands of Imaru, the buffer between Egypt and the Hittites, changed hands like dice in a gambler's palm. Every season, envoys carried threats disguised as peace offerings. Every year, the shadow of another war darkened the horizon, and through it all, Ramses prepared. He rebuilt his armies. He trained new charioteers, lighter and faster. He ordered bronze from Cyprus, grain from Nubia, horses from Canaan. The great temples he built were not only for worship, they were armories of faith, propaganda carved into eternity. But Muwatalli, the Hittite king, had died. And with his death came new storms. His brother Hattusili seized the throne in a violent coup, killing rivals, exiling priests, rewriting the order of the empire. This chaos in the north was Ramses' chance. The narrator's tone sharpens. And this is where everything began to shift. In the 12th year of his reign, Ramses marched north again. The pharaoh, who had once been deceived by spies, now moved with cunning precision. He split his army into coordinated divisions, communicating through signal fires and runners. His generals, once reckless with pride, had learned discipline born of loss. Every movement was calculated. Every step forward was a silent defiance of the humiliation he had once endured. The Egyptian banners once more reached the banks of the Orontes. The fields that had once been soaked with Egyptian blood now echoed with the rumble of their return. But this time, there was no ambush waiting. The Hittites were busy fighting each other. Town after town fell back into Egyptian hands. Still, Ramses did not rejoice. He knew the Hittites were too cunning, too proud, to remain silent forever, and he was right. Far to the north, in the city of Carchemish, Hattusili II gathered his new generals. His message was simple: the pharaoh will not take what is ours again. The two empires, once again, stood on the edge of war, but what neither ruler could have foreseen was the storm that would soon sweep across the world beyond their control. As Egypt and Hatti prepared to clash again, famine struck Anatolia. Crops failed. Trade collapsed. And from the northern seas came whispers of something else. Strangers, warriors without kings, seafarers who burned every shore they found. The ancient world was changing. And both Ramses and Hattusili would have to face an enemy neither could conquer alone. But before they could see that truth, the fires of pride had to burn once more. The camera draws close on Ramses. Now older, his jaw harder, his gaze sharper. He stands in his war tent, studying maps under torchlight. The flicker of flame dances across his face. "Prepare the chariots," he says. "We march at dawn." The Egyptian army surged forward again, banners streaming, drums echoing over the dunes. For days they advanced through enemy lands, reclaiming lost territory. Cities surrendered without a fight. Priests blessed the pharaoh's name, but as the army pressed deeper into Hittite lands, resistance grew fierce. The Hittite chariots met them once more, not in ambush this time, but in open combat. The field outside Aleppo became a sea of movement, two great powers, colliding under a sky thick with arrows. The earth itself trembled. Ramses rode at the head, his chariot streaking across the dust. His archers loosed volleys into the ranks of the Hittites. The enemy line wavered, then broke. Cheers rose. The Egyptians pursued, but as they crossed the plains, the victory began to sour. The further they advanced, the longer their supply lines stretched. Water ran short. Horses weakened. The Hittites retreated deliberately, drawing them deeper into hostile land. One night, as the pharaoh rested in his tent, a messenger burst in panic etched across his face. "My lord, the rear division has been attacked. The supply wagons burned." Ramses froze. It was Kadesh all over again. He rushed from his tent. The horizon was red with fire. Shouts echoed through the darkness. The Hittites had struck, not at his army, but at its stomach. By dawn, half his food was gone. The army could not advance. The heat, the hunger, the exhaustion, all of it returned like ghosts from that fateful day years before, and yet Ramses refused to turn back. He stood before his generals, his voice steady. "We have faced death before. We will not fear its shadow now. The gods test their chosen, and I am chosen." He ordered the troops to regroup, ration supplies, and hold the line. The Hittites attacked again, but Egypt stood firm this time. Their discipline, once broken at Kadesh, held strong. Then came the storm. Rain swept across the plains, black, cold, and violent. The battlefield turned to mud. Chariots sank. Horses stumbled. The thunder drowned out orders for 3 days. Both armies fought in a mire of chaos. On the 4th day, silence. Neither side could move. Neither side could win, and from this stalemate came something no one expected. Envoys rode out under white banners. They met in the no-man's land between the armies, not to surrender, but to speak. Egypt and Hatti had bled enough. Ramses, hardened by years of war, realized that no victory could last without peace. And Hattusili, beset by famine and rebellion, knew the same. Their meeting would mark the first recorded peace treaty in human history, the Treaty of Kadesh, written on silver tablets, engraved in 2 languages, bound the empires to coexist. It spoke of mutual defense, of shared prosperity, of eternal brotherhood between Egypt and Hatti. But here's what the inscriptions don't tell you. The peace was not born of friendship. It was born of exhaustion. Ramses returned to Egypt not as conqueror but as a survivor once more. Yet his people greeted him as a god who had brought peace where none thought possible. The myth of invincibility grew larger, brighter, eternal. In his temples, the treaty was carved beside the images of Kadesh, a war and peace united in stone, each half of the same divine story. And yet, even as the pharaoh basked in this golden illusion, storms gathered beyond the horizon. The northern seas boiled with fleets of unknown raiders. The sea, peoples whose arrival would soon shake both Egypt and Hatti to their cores. Neither empire could see it yet. For now the Nile glittered, the priests sang, and Ramses stood at the height of his glory. But glory, like sunlight, fades. The narrator's tone softens. And this is where the tide truly began to turn. In the years to come, Ramses would build monuments to eternity, temples carved into cliffs, statues taller than kings. His reign would stretch longer than any before him. But behind the stone, behind the hymns and gold, lingered the truth of Kadesh, that even the greatest of gods must one day face their own mortality. The final image lingers. Ramses, older now, walking through the halls of Abu Simbel, the torchlight dancing over carvings of his younger self in eternal victory. He pauses, looking up at the gods he once believed watched over him, and in that silence, he whispers to the stone, "We fought for glory, but peace is what endured." The camera slowly pans out, the sound of desert wind rising once more. The temples stand eternal, but the man within them fades into shadow. The world is changing. The empires that once ruled the earth are about to face something they cannot fight with chariots or pride. The aftermath of immortality, the desert, had long since swallowed the blood of Kadesh, but its memory still pulsed beneath the sands. Decades had passed since Pharaoh Ramesses II faced the Hittite chariots by the Orontes River, yet the echoes of that day never left him. They lingered in the songs of his people, in the reliefs that covered his temples, and in the quiet hours before dawn, when even a god could not escape the ghosts of men. Egypt now basked in the illusion of eternal glory. Cities flourished. Temples rose like mountains of stone. The people sang of a pharaoh who never knew defeat, who had stood alone before thousands and triumphed by divine will. But beneath the hymns, an unspoken truth whispered through the corridors of power. Ramses' greatest battle had not been against the Hittites. It had been against time itself. The camera opens on Thebes, the beating heart of the empire. The Nile glimmers beneath a crimson sunrise. Ramses, now in his later years, stands atop a terrace overlooking the river. The wind carries the scent of lotus and stone dust from the new temple rising on the opposite bank, Abu Simbel, his final monument to the gods and to himself. He gazes across the waters. His eyes older, his movements slower, yet his presence still commands silence. The priests approach cautiously, carrying scrolls, treaties, decrees, tributes from foreign lands. The world beyond Egypt had changed, but Ramses refused to yield to change. The Hittite treaty still held. Peace had lasted longer than anyone expected. But beyond the Fertile Crescent, new shadows stirred, raiders from the seas, nameless tribes pressing against the borders of empires that had once seemed eternal. The old order trembled, and still, Ramses built. He had temples carved into cliffs so that even when the desert buried everything, the sun itself would reveal his name at dawn. He ordered colossal statues of his image, faces of stone 30 meters tall, to guard the frontiers of memory. "Let no man forget who I was," he said once to his architects. Not even time? Yet the irony was cruel. The more he tried to defy oblivion, the more he felt its breath upon his neck. At night, he dreamed of Kadesh, of dust and thunder and 1,000 chariots breaking from the hills. He would wake drenched in sweat, hearing again the screams, the thunder of wheels, the sound of his own heartbeat echoing like war drums. Sometimes, in those restless hours, he would whisper to the darkness, "Did I win? Or did I merely survive?" And the darkness would not answer, but the world would. From the north came the messengers, breathless, terrified. The Hittite Empire, once mighty, was burning. Cities fell to invaders whose origins no one could trace. They came from the sea, from the mist, from nowhere. They were called the Sea Peoples, and they were unstoppable. "They have taken Ugarit," the envoy gasped. "Carchemish is threatened." The Hittite king begs Egypt for aid. Ramses' gaze hardened. The words echoed through the hall like distant thunder. The Hittites, Egypt's ancient enemy, now called for help. What happened next? No historian expected. Ramses, once deceived by those same kings, now found himself the last pillar of a collapsing world. He could have turned away. He could have let his old enemies drown. But something inside him, pride, perhaps, or the stubborn will of a man who refused to bow to fate, made him act. He gathered his generals. "If the world burns," he said, "then Egypt will be the last light." The Sea Peoples came like a tide of iron. Their ships blackened the horizon. Their warriors, tall, fierce, their helmets crowned with plumes, struck terror wherever they landed. No city, no army could withstand them, but Egypt was not any army. Egypt had Ramses. Along the delta of the Nile, he prepared his defenses. He built walls, raised fleets, trained archers day and night. The Pharaoh, who had once fought beneath the blazing Syrian sun, now commanded from the heart of his kingdom. Older, wiser, yet as unyielding as the stone statues that bore his face. When the invaders came, Egypt was ready. The clash at the mouths of the Nile was a storm of arrows and flame. Ramses' ships cut through the enemy fleets. His archers turned the sky into a rain of death. For days the waters ran red. But when the battle ended, Egypt still stood. The invaders were crushed, their ships burned, their survivors enslaved. The old pharaoh had done what no other could. He had faced the collapse of empires, and survived once more, and yet there was no triumph in his eyes. The victory was hollow. The world beyond Egypt lay in ruins. The Hittites were gone, their cities reduced to ash. The old trade routes were silent. The bronze that once fueled armies no longer flowed. Egypt remained, but it was now an island in a sea of ghosts. The narrator's tone softens. And this is where everything changed again? Ramses walked through the halls of Abu Simbel, where artisans carved his victories into stone. He paused before a relief depicting Kadesh himself standing tall in his chariot, bow drawn, enemies crushed beneath his horses. The artisans looked up as he approached. "Make the lines deeper," he said quietly. "Let the sun see them forever." They obeyed. But behind his command was something unsaid, the awareness that forever is a word even kings cannot control. The years weighed on him. The empire that had once marched under his command began to fade at its edges. Bureaucrats grew fat with corruption. Provinces rebelled. Grain was scarce. The people still worshipped him as a god, but the man beneath the crown felt the cost of being divine. He would stand before the mirror of polished bronze and see not a god, but an old man with tired eyes, staring into the past, and still he ruled, 67 years on the throne, longer than any pharaoh before him. Generations were born and died under his reign. His sons led campaigns in his name. His daughters became priestesses, queens, or wives of gods. His people began to call him the eternal pharaoh, but immortality has a price. Late one evening, as the stars shimmered above Thebes, Ramses wandered into his garden alone. The night air was cool, and the sound of the Nile drifted like a lullaby. He looked up at the constellations, the same stars that had guided his army to Kadesh so long ago. "I have built my temples," he murmured. "I have carved my name into the mountains. But will they remember the man? Or only the myth?" For a moment, the illusion of eternity cracked. He could almost hear the voices of those who had fallen at Kadesh, soldiers who never saw their families again, charioteers buried beneath sand and bronze. They had fought for him, for Egypt, for glory. But he alone had become the legend. Most people never knew this detail, that Ramses ordered prayers for the souls of the fallen each year on the anniversary of Kadesh. Quiet ceremonies, far from the eyes of the court. He would stand beside the priests, eyes closed, as incense rose into the air, whispering names that no one else remembered. It was his way of making peace with the dead, and perhaps with himself, but fate had something else planned. As the old pharaoh's strength began to fade, his enemies gathered not outside the borders, but within them. Ambitious nobles, restless priests, foreign mercenaries, all waiting for the day Egypt's living god would finally close his eyes. He knew it. He saw it in their faces, in the way they bowed too deeply, smiled too quickly. The empire he had forged now balanced on his heartbeat, and so Ramses did what he had always done. He fought time itself. He began constructing his tomb. Hidden deep in the Valley of the Kings, a labyrinth carved into the earth, filled with treasures, texts, and walls inscribed with his deeds. "When the sands reclaim the cities," he told his architects, "this place will still speak my name." As his health waned, he returned one last time to Abu Simbel. The sun struck the statues of his younger self, their faces serene, unyielding. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cold stone cheek of his own image. "Perhaps," he whispered, "this is what victory means. Not conquest, not power, but being remembered." The desert wind rose, carrying grains of sand across the colossal faces. The sound was like the whisper of time itself. He closed his eyes. When Ramses the Great died, the world mourned a god. But history, silent, merciless, remembered the man who fought not to win, but to endure, and though the centuries would bury his temples and crumble his empire, the name he carved in stone still glows when the morning sun touches the cliffs of Abu Simbel. The narrator's voice fades into a haunting calm. Empires fall, kings fade, but memory endures. The camera pans back, over the Nile, over the desert, over the endless sands that once drank the blood of Kadesh, somewhere beneath that same sky. Time moves on, yet the echoes of chariots still whisper through the wind, and as the sun rises once more over Egypt, the question remains: was the pharaoh's last stand at Kadesh the birth of a god, or the last breath of a man who refused to be forgotten?